Welcome to Bounce Back Stronger, the podcast that explores ways to find peace and purpose after difficulty. I'm your host, Donna Ferris, and today we have Pete Sidley, a leader in the healing and wellness field, with us. A little about Pete. Since 1994, Pete has been co-facilitating the groundbreaking Living in Process healing work created by acclaimed author Dr. Wilson Schaef. And today, he serves as president of Wilson Schaef Associates, Inc. Pete has dedicated over 25 years to the Living in Process mission, continuing to facilitate these transformative groups worldwide, even after Anne's passing in 2020. Pete, thank you for joining us on Bounce Back Stronger. I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. And we met because I reached out to see if Anne could be on the podcast and was sad to realize that she had already passed. So thank you for making time to meet with me.
Sure, yeah, it was sad for all of us that she passed. She was a great person and a great writer. We still read her books all the time. And people used to say about Anne that she was 50 years before her time. And it's really coming true now. Like a lot of the books she wrote in the 80s, people are starting to talk about those different things she was writing about now. And it's like it's almost more timely now, some of the things she wrote. So yeah, she was a great loss to this planet, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to put the book up. It's not going to be easy to see, but this is the book that I was reaching out about. It's Meditations for Women Who Do Too Much. And this book I recommend all the time. This is one of the three books I read every morning. I read like little devotions. One is not enough for me, so I have to go through a couple of them. And I love her wisdom. I don't think it's just for women. I think it's for all of us to do too much. But maybe if you could take a moment, is that one of the books that you hear a lot about from people?
Well, yes. So, and that book came about from it was actually the idea of her publisher. And the first book that Anne ever wrote was called Women's Reality, and it was written in 1981.
Mhm.
And she actually wrote that book in about 5 days.
Wow.
And that book, yeah, that was a great book. And in that she started writing about, some of the things, how she saw the world and the different systems that she sees going on in the world. At that point, she called it the white male system, the reactive female system, and an emerging female system. Three different systems she wrote about in that book. And she
Wow.
wrote a few more books, and then her publisher came to her in the late 80s to write that book, and it was supposed to be about workaholism for women that were workaholics. And it was really just a taste of what her like worldview is.
Mm.
And somehow that particular book hit a nerve and sold several million.
Did my nerves. It got me.
As
Got
Anne
me.
used to say, what woman doesn't do too much?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Especially if they're
so
working outside the home too. We have enough to do at home and then you add going outside. Yeah, it's a lot.
absolutely. So yeah, that book is still selling, and we still hear about that all the time. And even though it was like a quote unquote little meditation book.
I love that book. But what was great is I didn't know much about living in process. And interesting enough, I'm sober too. So I'd love to hear about living in process and the types of events that you're leading now.
Okay, well, I'm gonna give you a little bit of the history then about living in process. So Anne was Cherokee, and her parents didn't tell her that.
Mm,
They could pass for white, and she was born in 1934, and that was a time where the residential schools were happening down there, and the Indian kids were being taken. And so one of the ways that her family protected her was to not tell her she was Cherokee.
wow.
And even though they raised her in a very traditional Cherokee way, she grew up. Well, her family did a lot of traveling around, but a large part of it was in Arkansas, Oklahoma territory, Cherokee country. And so when she was a young girl, she knew that she wanted to be like a healer of some sort or something like that. That kind of led her into psychotherapy.
Mm,
And so she got her PhD and she trained as a psychologist. And after a while, she left the field. She found that psychotherapy helped people to adapt to an addictive system, to a system that we have created that isn't good for us.
mm,
And so she started doing the living in process work, and it was based on her Cherokee upbringing and what she learned from her own experiences in the field of psychotherapy. She started doing it in the late 70s, early 80s. It's been going on for that long, and it's a different paradigm. It doesn't come out of the same scientific worldview that therapy comes out of, and it's really healing. We talk about three different components in the living process work, and I'll very briefly touch on them. One is
Yeah, please.
recovery from addictions. In this society that we live, as I mentioned earlier, Anne had talked about the white male system and the emerging female system. And in her later books, named the white male system an addictive system,
Mm,
and the technological, material, mechanistic system. All three of those names were she's sort of naming the same thing, which is the dominant system that we're living in now.
mhm.
And one of the requirements of that system is that we be addicted, not know what we know and not feel what we feel and not think what we think and not be who we can be. And so one of the main components of living process, first of all, is to look at what we might be addicted to and start recovery from that. And
Yeah.
what we found is that like the 12-step programs are what we have seen as to be the most effective thing for people recovering from addictions, and it's not the only way. And as you may know, there's now 12-step meetings for every letter of the alphabet practically. There's so many
Yeah.
different groups for different types of addictions, and that's a big part of what we deal with. And then we go beyond the 12-step groups. There's places in our workshops for people to actually feel their feelings, for example, or go into what we call the deep process work to deal
Mm,
with what comes up when they get sober, basically, the feelings that come up. And unlike AA or other groups, those 12-step programs are awesome. They're designed by addicts for addicts, and there is no place in the 12-step meetings for feelings, really, and that's
no.
fine. And
Yeah.
what we do, there are mats around the room that we meet in, and if something comes up, we have a place for them to deal with it. And then the third component of living processes is really making a complete paradigm shift. One of the latest books that Anne wrote before she died was called Daily Reminders for Living a New Paradigm.
Mm.
It's really a whole way of living that's different. A lot of it is based on her upbringing. The Cherokee way or the Native American way is really quite different from the dominant system here.
Is that a meditation book too? Like the daily
That
reminder? So it's like a daily, I might have
It
to get
is.
that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I think the way that she set it up was she came up with 30 different topics. And then each month she sort of builds on the topic. Like
Oh
if
wow.
she, like, let's say awareness, she might
Yeah.
write on that on June 3rd. And then on February 3rd, she builds on that a little bit. And then March 3rd. And so it goes throughout the year. And we read it all the time. It's fantastic. And it didn't get much press, but it's really a great book.
I'll have to read it. In your description of living in process, the feelings piece, I have people come up with the feeling, like, what do I do with this feeling all the time? Can you take a minute on that about some of the ways people can process their feelings in a safe and healthy way?
Sure. I would say the biggest thing that I would suggest, or that the way that we do it, is stay with it. Like
Yeah.
if you feel a feeling, stay with it, feel it. Often at our workshops, we'll say anything can trigger a feeling. Sometimes you may be sitting there and somebody walks in the room and you instantly hate them. And it's like,
Yes.
great, stay with that
Yeah.
and see what that's about and go with it. We had a meeting the other day and somebody in our group was talking about how to express their anger. We don't really go that route exactly of how to express it right. It's in some ways we're more simple than that. It's like feel it, like stay with it. If you stay with your anger, for example, it will take you somewhere else. If you just stay with it and not try to figure it out and not
Mhm.
try to blame somebody else or blame yourself, but simply stay with it and go with it. And what we say is that leads often to what we call a deep process. Whatever the initial feeling may be, may lead to something totally different. One of the things we say about the deep process work is it bypasses the left brain. It's not something that we try to control or manage or manipulate. It's just something that we stay with and see where it goes and take time with, especially in our workshops and our training groups. We just take time with staying with the feelings as long as it may take. Some people stay with a certain feeling for several days or weeks or whatever, just to see what it is. They're not bad. And
Mhm.
sometimes certain feelings get labeled as bad, like anger, and just to stay with it and see where it goes. And I believe a lot of times people in our groups, including myself, feel like that's the place where we connect with our higher power the most by feeling the feeling and taking us through into our deep process and just seeing what it comes up with, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think feelings are teaching us something. We're having an intense response to something, and we probably need to think about what that is.
Well, I would stay away from thinking about it. I would
Okay.
stay with the feeling because
Mm,
often our thinking stops us. Sometimes people come in and they have agendas about this is what I need to work on. I need to work on this, and this, and that often keep them stuck. Our deep process work goes beyond that. It's like if we stay with the feelings and let go of our thinking and see where it takes us, then I agree with you that we can learn something.
mhm.
And often it's after we've done the process that like, oh, that's what's going on. I'm still holding on to this, or my experience. Sometimes people process old childhood things or old pain of the earth things.
So what does the processing look like?
Well, I think it's different for different people. I think it's as individual as anything. Sometimes people will go stretch out on a mat
Mm,
and they'll be there for 5 minutes and that's it. And sometimes people don't want to go to the mats. They'll sit in their chair and they'll do whatever. Sometimes people will stay on the mats. And we have people that come to an intensive and they may stay on the mat for 3 days. They may scream or cry for part of it or not, or be silent. Again, we don't have a prescription of how it's supposed to be or an agenda of how it's supposed to be. And some people, they're so far away from their feelings, they don't have any. They don't know. I mean, myself included. When I started doing this work, I was told, well, what do you feel? And I was like, well, what do you mean? And like, well, what do you feel? And I was like, well, what do you mean? I don't know. I don't feel anything. My toes are cold. That was the best I could come up with. And we see
yeah.
that people have no awareness of what they feel.
Oh, I agree with that. When I started doing yoga, one of the first things that really kind of stopped me was somebody at the beginning of class said, "How do you feel?" And I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah, that's
I
real cool.
I
I
had
think
no idea.
I think that's sort of required for the addictive system is that we don't
Yes.
feel what we feel. The best adjusted person in this society is a robot.
Yeah.
Someone that doesn't isn't dead but isn't alive,
Yeah.
you know. And so
Yeah.
that's I understand.
Which is why I think Sharon Salzberg says the most important thing is to be aware. Her whole thing is when you're doing meditation, we all drift away in a few breaths, but it's the awareness that we've been gone. And I think that's the same thing with addiction. It's the awareness that you've been gone and you've been trying to numb something that you're feeling. And it's hard to be aware. I think that's one of the hardest things to do is to just know it's happening.
Yeah, I think so. When Anne was writing Living in Process is it's a whole system. And it was hard for her and the publishers to sort of get together because the publishers wanted answers in a real mechanistic square book. And
Yeah.
it was like putting a round ball into a square hole.
Right.
And at one point, as they were sort of negotiating how to write the book, they suggested to her, can you just give us some ideas or what people might do? And that was really hard. And after wrestling it for a while, one of the things that she came up with was noticing, like awareness, like noticing when you feel anything or noticing when you have to go to the bathroom. There's a lot of people that don't know when they have to go to the bathroom or don't know when they're tired.
Hmm.
And I think that that is a big part of starting and living in process work and just in life too. I agree. This noticing what you feel or where you're at.
Yeah, noticing that we've been away. How did you get involved with Anne?
Well, I went to college at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I
Okay.
happened to be there when Anne was living there. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I was kind of bottoming out in my life and not happy at the school and da da da. And I actually got Anne's name from my mom. My mom was living in Minnesota and she knew someone that knew Anne. And so I called her up, and this was in the mid 80s. And so I started doing the living and process work back then. And so I did the work for a while living in Colorado. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, Anne had bought an old hot springs hotel in Montana.
Wow.
And so I came up and lived there, which that's actually where I am right now,
Wow.
and started working with her and traveling with her. And since then, that was the early 90s.
And then you've been doing it for that whole time.
Yep, the whole time. And I've loved it. It was great. Anne was great. And it was a
Yeah.
real gift to be around her.
Yeah, I imagine. One of the things I think we've kind of been touching around, I like this idea of reconnecting with spiritual wisdom. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? It feels like that's a big part of this as well.
I think that Anne used to talk about how the living and process work goes beyond like the rituals and the ceremonies.
Yeah.
It's like older than that.
Yeah.
It's like all of us have inside of us that deep wisdom, I think.
Hmm.
And again, I think that the addictions and the crazy system we're living in, I think part of the system we're living in is just this crazy thinking,
Mm,
dualistic thinking and self-centeredness. One of Ann's books was called When Society Becomes an Addict.
mm.
And that was a New York Times bestseller. That is so timely right now. Like the
Yeah,
society is acting like an addict. And
yeah.
I think all the components of addicts are in the society right now. And those are the kind of things that keep us from our wisdom, our spirituality. It's like being addicted and being caught up in all the drama and the technology and all kinds of things that keep us away from who we really are. And I think that's where we connect with our spirituality, I think is who we really are and within ourselves.
And we already know the answers really inside of us, right? But we just can't get out of our own way to find them.
I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some other common challenges you see?
Well, the addictive process is very far-reaching, far and wide. One of the issues is that we have it in ourselves. It's not just in the culture and being demanded of us from outside. It's also within us. We have a woman here at the Hot Springs. She's in our groups and she's wonderful. And it's really interesting to watch how she has these beliefs that she's no good. We've called her on her thought process around it, and she gets into a sort of a circular thing in her head about how she's no good. And we also see people like move past that too when they're willing to do their deep process work and often find something else. That's a big one, is that people are carrying this sort of addictive system inside of them. And there's not a lot of support too. A lot of times people will come and they'll have a partner that doesn't want them to be here. They don't want them to get well. They want to keep them in the relationship. And so that sometimes is an issue. And I
Mhm.
think another one is a lot of the times is there's so many other things going on that a lot of times people will come to our workshops and they think they already know what it is. And that's a big one. That's a big stopper. So, there's certain things that we see that are stoppers. Let me just mention one other of Anne's books. One of her last books was called There Will Be 1,000 Years of Peace and Prosperity, and it will be ushered in by the women. And
I love that.
it's a great book. In there, she talks about stoppers. And in this particular case, she's talking about women, like women tell themselves that stop them. And that's a lot that we see in the groups is people just their own stoppers.
Yeah.
And thinking is a big problem, a
Yes.
huge problem. We've really learned to think ourselves into a hole in this Western culture, and
Yeah.
and often doesn't make any sense. And so again, the deep process work goes beyond that, and it's a process. You can't really get it at one workshop, you
No,
know.
I bet. There's a couple things there, but one, I'm a big believer in you are the sum of the five people that you are around a lot that are in your surroundings. And I think that's why it's so important to be really careful about that. And I think what you said about you can be around people who don't want you to get better. And it's really important to have people around you that are invested in, or at least supportive of your recovery. I do really believe that. The other thing I have to ask you, so there's so many books, and you already know what I'm going to ask. There's so many books here that are all about women. How does it feel to be in the center of that and talking about that?
I, that's a funny question. Yeah. I guess the first thing that comes up for me is very early on, Anne used to say, something like if she were a man, that her books might have been more well received. And
I love that.
I started working with her again in the early 90s, and this work has always been mostly women. The first training group, as we call the people that really want to, learn how to live in the process. The first group I was in, I think there was maybe 45 women and 5 men.
Well,
And mostly I really like it, you know.
yeah, I bet you do.
I
I mean,
do.
yeah, I can see that. I like the way she talks about women as being as a reactive process, but there's also a connection there in that reactivity that we can actually move beyond it. And I think it's social. We've been socialized to be more in contact with our feelings. So that might
Yeah.
help us. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, one time a number of years ago, I did a speaking tour in Europe with a woman named Rose Perry, who was a Maori Tahunga. She was like a Maori spiritual woman from New Zealand. One of her main things was the women are 5,000 years ahead of the men. And I actually can see that. This culture has really damaged women, and this culture has really damaged men. And it's been a privilege. I mean, I think I've really grown much more as a person by especially hanging out with Anne, but most people that I've hung out with are women in the network, and it's been good for me. I believe there'll be 1,000 years of peace and prosperity, and they'll be ushered in by the women. And sometimes I do think, well, I might be more effective in my role if I was a woman. And that's the way it is. I am who I am. And I was the one that Anne asked to co-facilitate, and it is what it is. So I deal with it.
Well, you were meant to be there, obviously, but I can't not ask the question because I know it's probably in the listener's mind. But if it means anything, it sounds like, at least to me, that Anne picked well. Is there anything I missed that I should have asked as we start to draw to a close?
I think one other thing I'd mention is just a little bit more about the paradigm shift, that it's really a whole way of being. We don't have any techniques or any answers, really. Just before the call, I was reading the intro to Women Who Do Too Much Again, and she talked about that in the intro of the book. Like, I don't have any answers. And it's about a process. Sometimes when we meet here at this place with Boulder Hot Springs, there'll be issues with the building. And we'll deal with the issues of the building because that's what is. We believe that we can't heal the people without healing the building, and we can't heal the building without healing the land, and we can't heal the land without healing the people. And so it's like, it's
Mm,
all part of it, and the animals and all the birds and all creation is part of healing. And so when we look at it on all levels, not just psychological or mental, we look at everything. So
it's really helpful. It's all connected, right? I think
yeah.
that's the basis here. Well, if a person like me wanted to buy a book to kind of start, what book would you suggest that I buy to understand the living in process?
Well, Anne wrote a book called Living in Process.
So just
And
read that one.
I love that book. It's kind of meant to be read over time. It's like,
Hmm.
I think I read it through the first time, and then, slowly I'll pick up a chapter here or there, a part of it. And I think that's a great book. But again, when society becomes an addict is so timely right now,
Yeah,
especially so it's hard to say. Of course, I'm very biased. I think Anne is the greatest, and I love her writing, and I think they're all good. But maybe Living in Process I'd recommend, I guess.
it'd be a starting point. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your work. It's very, very helpful to so many, it seems, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks for having me, and good luck with your projects too.
Thank you so much. That's all for today. If you want to learn more about Pete Sidley and Living in Process, those links will be in the episode notes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode was helpful. If it was, please subscribe, drop a review, or share it with your friends and family. That's the best way to get it in the hands of those who may benefit. And if my daughters, Sienna and Sylvia, are listening, I want you to know how proud I am of you, and I love you so much. Bye now.